So Freud was trying to do exactly what we're trying to do today, with one huge difference, namely that there was no data on the neurophysiological and neuroanatomical side. It was literally impossible to study anything about the living brain and its workings. The only method they had was dissection of the cadaver at autopsy, and then microscopic study of its elements. But those methods don't tell you anything about what's going on in the brain when somebody is conscious versus unconscious, when they're in a state of resistance, when they're in this or that affective state, and so on. So Freud was obliged to abandon the effort because it was just pure speculation. He was just imagining what kind of neurophysiology and neuroanatomy might correspond to the
Yeah.
functional dynamics that he had inferred. So ironically, and I really want to emphasize this, ironically, because Freud was a good scientist, he abandoned neuroscience. There's so many people think it's the opposite. Freud was a good neuroscientist and then he abandoned science for psychology. But no, it was quite the other way around. In order to still have access to empirical data, to be actually able to observe, the things that he was studying, to be able to make predictions, if I do this, then that will happen, which is the essence of science. He could only do that on the psychological side. And so in order to advance the science of the mind, Freud had to stick with purely psychological observations. And of course, the crucial thing is that that's no longer the case. We now have methods, many powerful methods. And so that's why we've been able to pick up again where Freud left off, as he always hoped his intellectual or scientific heirs would do.
Yeah, it's as I've been working on some other Lacan stuff, it's actually, and this isn't usually recognized. I think it's relatively well recognized, at least that Freud was a neurologist, and then whether people, say he abandoned neurology versus, as Mark is saying, he was a good scientist, and therefore that's why he invented psychoanalysis. Lacan actually was trained in neuropsychiatry before he became a psychoanalyst. And it's well known that Lacan trained as a psychiatrist before, but the training milieu in early what would that be, 20th century France was very much like all the main academic psychiatric places. They were run by neurologists. And they were all actually, it's funny because if you trace the academic lineage, it goes back to Charcot as well. So they were all run by neurologists. And it's really interesting. There are these early case presentations that Lacan co-authored with other sort of trainees and stuff, and they're all neuropsychiatric patients. And so when I found these, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. No one's ever talked about this either. And by neuropsychiatric, I mean, and they were mainly post-encephalitic patients. So patients who had, sort of due to infection, encephalitis of the central nervous system in the brain. And so lots of kind of quasi-Parkinsonian and also very interesting sort of confabulatory delusional presentations as well. And so I was going through these, and these are kind of before he writes these kind of key papers on his own position. So he's basically still like an intern or like a medical resident at this point when he's doing these papers. And it's really interesting because I think that the trajectory is kind of similar to Freud, where Freud invents psychoanalysis to stay true to the phenomenon of mental experience and to try to capture it as best he can with that method. And when Lacan writes about this kind of transition point, when he's critiquing current organicist theories of mental phenomena, the critique, at least the way that I read it, and also the critique of some people at that time in 1920s, 1930s, 1935 in France, who were trying to already at that point integrate organic theories, Hewlings-Jackson's dissolution model with psychoanalysis at that time in France. His critique was that the sort of the purely deficit model that you get from that and the sort of explanation by reduction to non-mental, i.e. purely automatic biological processes, or rather an interpretation of biological processes as just automatic, not in any way intentional or meaningful. That's the critique. And then his sort of manifesto at this point, he kind of writes about, and this is also in his doctoral thesis, looking at personality as kind of the proper level of analysis to be making sense of these mental phenomena, in psychosis especially. And then he defines personality as a quote unquote, a set of specialized functional relationships between man and his particular environment, the social environment. And so again, when I was reading this, it's like, oh, look, there's that key signifier, function. And that, so it's this really interesting, I think, parallel between Lacan and Freud. And just the other thing I'll add on the project, another, I think, important point that unlike some analysts, Lacan doesn't sort of dismiss the project as neuroscientific baggage. When you read his engagements with the project, it's very nuanced, Lacan's remarks on it, and he's not rejecting the idea of there being anything relevance that comes up from the biology. In fact, his interpretation of the project, I think it's already directing or moving toward more like computational light versions, because he was already interested in game theory at this point, and cybernetics was becoming a thing as he's kind of doing this writing. So yeah, that's sorry, that's a bit rambly, but that's what came to mind for that.